Cool.
Now we don't have anything to say now that we're recording.
No. Stage fright. Yeah, so we're talking about Foucault. We already accidentally started talking about it before we hit record.
Right. Oops.
Yeah, so we're back to Foucault.
Yeah.
And the History of Sexuality. Antushka wanted to do this one. It was his idea.
Wait, it was?
No, it was my idea.
Yeah. So what do you think so far, just reading Foucault, just a general view of Foucault the guy? What's your impression?
I think, and this is why I wanted to read him, I think that his philosophies, whether people realize them, have incepted modern day society, and is sort of, I think, what a lot of people are afraid. A lot of the changes that are occurring, I think it's because of his philosophy. Whether or not he wasn't the only one espousing these ideas in the 60s and 70s. The other French intellectuals were too.
Right.
But yeah.
Interesting. Well, so then it'll be interesting to get into it and to see where you're seeing it in the modern world.
Well, and you could say, honestly, it started with Nietzsche, but it's the idea that everything is about power dynamics.
Right. Mm-hmm.
That's a big
one of my questions that I have written is, what does he mean by power?
Actually... so I was just reading the Wikipedia before. Just, I don't know. I like to just, after I read something, I like to read somebody else's review just to see, like, am I completely off on these ideas? But, we didn't read this part. We just started with the first two chapters. I mean, I've read basically the whole first volume. And so in the part 5, which is the last part of the first volume, Right of Death and Power over Life, he starts to talk about power. And I thought the Wikipedia page honestly had some good quotes about what his definition of power is. And yeah, just to start to say that he's basically saying that in medieval times, it was a right to death, actually, and then it switched, and this big change occurred in the 17th century into the 20th century. That's another big Foucault theme.
Yes.
That, things started to change around this time. It then switched to right to life, and specifically, Foucault talks about this thing called biopower.
Biopower.
And yeah, it comes in two forms. One is centered on the body as a machine, and then the other is on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life and serving as the basis of the biological processes, like birth and mortality and stuff. So it's basically saying that how I interpret it is that, the state was becoming a thing that wanted actually to prolong people's lives because people were important for capitalism.
Right.
He also sort of ties it to this. The workforce is important for creating goods, so you want them to be healthy.
Right.
So, in some ways, it's like a good incentive, but then it also has these other things, obviously.
Right.
And this, he basically, he wow, we just got into a whole thing without even talking about the history of sexuality, because this is all related to sexuality, because it's basically his whole point, I guess, to summarize the whole first volume in a very simple phrase, would be that sexuality, there's this hypothesis, the repressive hypothesis, that beginning in the 17th century, people started to become repressive of sex and not talk about it.
Right.
But in actuality, there was actually an explosion of discourse.
Right.
So Foucault his whole thing is actually in opposition of that hypothesis. And he's saying actually there's actually more talk about sex, but it was in these sort of sterile environments with the correct vocabulary. And also in illicit forms. And so there's pornography that's discussed that, becomes really explicit in the 19th century.
Right.
And then you have a multiplication of sexualities instead of just, you're a sodomite, you have all of these sort of subsections of the type and everything like that, and people and confessions,
Right.
and stuff, and so that's the big summary. And so he ties this to the life and death thing because it's actually this discursiveness, this discursivity of sex or whatever it is, making a discourse out of sex. Is for power, ultimately,
Right.
Because it's used as a way to control people. If you go out of the lines of what the normal sort of sexuality is, then you become susceptible to all sorts of measures by the state.
Right.
And so that's where the power comes in, and so there we go.
Right.
Podcast done.
Kinda.
Next.
Yeah. Next. Yeah.
Sorry. No, there's a lot of interesting stuff to say.
So I feel like I didn't quite get the power part. I have a sense.
Yeah, sorry,
it's not that I don't have a sense for what power means. I'm just curious because I feel like I don't follow exactly what he means by power. I mean, the state, I guess, but the state's like an example of a type of power.
Yes, I'm sorry. I said that I had a definition, and yes, it's actually in the fourth part that there's a nice definition. He says power should be understood as a multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate.
A multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate.
Yeah.
Okay. Force relations. I don't even totally not get it. I kind of am there. It just feels amorphous enough that I'm wondering if it's a meaningful definition.
Yeah.
Force relations. What is a force relation?
Well, I think it's
like
just
I push you.
Any transfer. Exactly.
That's a force relation.
Yeah.
So a multiplicity. So power is if I'm pushing a whole bunch of people in my social circle. I just go around pushing people.
Yeah, so apparently this quote's on page 92, 93, or thereabouts, in the deployment of sexuality. Power must be understood in the first instance as the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate and which constitute their own organization. As the process which, through ceaseless struggle and confrontations, transforms, strengthens, or even reverses them, as the support which these force relations find in one another, thus forming a chain or a system, or on the contrary, the disjunctions and contradictions which isolate them from one another. And lastly, as the strategies in which they take effect, whose general design or institutional crystallization is embodied in the state apparatus and the formulation of the law and the various social hegemonies. So obviously he gives at the end the very real sort of examples of power,
right?
Like in the law and social etiquette and stuff like that,
right?
But yes, he gave a very amorphous. I don't know, how is that?
I don't know. I mean, look, I half get it, and I half think that he's
being poetic, overly poetic.
I mean, I don't even think it's overly poetic. I think it's overly academicized or something. It's.
I think it's overly poetic, but I think that's part of the point.
Do you think
that was
poetic?
The whole thing? Yeah, because that's the whole thing. I think that he's sort of got from Nietzsche also is like being kind of poetical when you talk about your philosophy.
Yeah, I would say he's a lot less clear than Nietzsche. Even Nietzsche in translation is clearer.
Right. Yeah. But there is an interesting. I mean, this is kind of an interesting just philosophy difference between, I guess, Germans and French people, which is interesting because, you do have, I mean, for two countries that are right next to each other, I guess that's how it always happens.
Yeah. I mean, I read this and it brings me back to grad school. And just like...
Yeah, exactly.
It half annoys me reading it. Just like, come on.
But to my point
just say
about
what you mean.
him but to my point about Foucault, I mean, I thought this was why you wanted to read Foucault to begin with, because it was you were the one who got us on.
I don't hate Foucault, but like he annoys me a bit. Like I don't think I like Foucault as a guy.
Right, but I was just saying that this is what I meant by how I feel like he has incepted our everything today in academia and sort of the philosophies that underpin a lot of, I guess, the things that are in the humanities departments around the country.
I would say that a lot of the humanities departments, at least that I'm aware of, see Foucault as, yes, part of their lineage, but this kind of piece of history. And most people don't do postmodernism anymore. Most people do critical theory.
Yes.
And so like
I agree.
Marcuse and Adorno and stuff have much higher places in the realm of academic discourse than
overt discourse. Right. And that's, I guess, my point is and honestly, we should read them, by the way, because I actually haven't read them. So
it's rough, but yeah.
Yeah. And I know they are contemporaries, if I'm not mistaken, right? Because Foucault was writing, he graduated in the 50s, I think, and so he was writing in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And he died in the 80s.
The Frankfurt School, as I'm aware, is like between the wars is when it really gets going. But it traces its roots back to the 1910s, I think. It's alongside the progressive movement.
Right. So, I mean, they are probably the originators. So, what I guess my point is, Foucault was influenced likely by them then, do you think?
I think so. I mean, he, as far as I understand, the postmodernists consider themselves distinct. That they don't think that they're critical theorists.
Interesting.
Because the postmodernists, at least this is my understanding, and we haven't read this particular in Foucault yet, but my understanding is the postmodernist claim is that critical theorists are sort of small-minded, because critical theorists tend to be dealing with a specific type of power relation, i.e. kind of like oppressor-oppressed. And postmodernists think that power relations are much more fluid and complex than that.
Yeah.
And that they're really, like, oppressor-oppressed isn't a static system. And this is what I was getting. I mean, I did get that, like, the idea that these systems are dynamic and complex from what we were reading, because he was talking about even a system of repression then develops sort of a subversive system of needing to combat against it, which is in and of itself a different version of that system of repression. And so it's like everything is sort of washing around in a washing machine, interacting with each other. It's not, bad guys on top, good guys on bottom kind of a thing.
Can you summarize critical theory?
I would say basically a view of history with the primary goal of identifying an oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, just to me that sounds like the same exact thing as Foucault.
Yeah, maybe. Right.
So whoever originated this, right? Because, so the power thing, again, you could actually probably a better progenitor to all of those groups is Nietzsche, right? He was, I think, the first big guy to talk about power. Right. I mean, he has obviously his antecedents too, Schopenhauer, Hegel. Yeah, but I guess, I mean, you're right though, because very few people have heard of Foucault. So I guess what I'm trying to think is, maybe. And then I guess the other ways that I think that he's influential, aside from the fact that like everything's a power dynamic, because I guess I just think maybe he brought it to a much more, where Nietzsche talked about power, everybody has a will to power. He talked about power. Foucault talked about power with a very defined, actually ironically defined precision about like the state being this power apparatus, and how it's doing all these things, whether it's mental health, as we talked about when we did the podcast on madness and civilization, 5-point whatever episodes, if anybody's curious. Shout out to ourselves. But that was the same thing. Yeah, but that was the same thing. It was talking about institutional sort of power and arbitrarial. Like, I think ultimately Foucault's points are that, look, these things are sometimes arbitrary.
Right.
But this is where I would push back on other more provocative points he gets at in the History of Sexuality, which I think he sort of discusses as if they're arbitrary, whereas I think that they're not. And I don't know if we can even get into it yet. But yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, so his starting point of, the idea that sex was something that was more openly discussed before the 17th and 18th century, like the end of the 17th century. It was something that was not covered in taboo in the same way. Yeah,
it wasn't that it was discussed, actually. It wasn't discussed before the 17th century.
You're right. Not discussed, but it wasn't...
only in confessional, I should say. That was the one point. And he says, like, the confessional served as a precursor to a lot of things, like, the psychiatrist-patient sort of relationship, or just doctor-patient relationship of tell me everything kind of thing. Let's try to understand this.
Right.
And reduce it into a thing.
Right. So I guess
it's just that it wasn't discussed. It was just understood that people just did these things, and if they obviously went against certain, norms, there were still rules that govern, obviously, how you're supposed to relate with your colleagues in a sexual manner. But
yeah.
Yeah, but they were. I think it was less spoken about overtly. Is his point.
Right. I mean,
I don't know. Did you get that impression? You tell me.
Is
does that sound right
history.
Though?
Yeah.
Okay.
Less spoken about. I guess less like taboo is kind of what I took away from it. That it didn't have It didn't have both the side of like overly clinical jargon speak. And then, like rampant pornography and like deviant behavior, quote. It was, like it's a fact of life. So there isn't a need to talk about it to the degree that he's saying they started talking about it at the end of the 17th century. And this is one of those things where it's, I guess I don't know the social history. I don't even know how I would know it. I did a little reading on the side of just some Hildegard stuff on sex, which is interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Because she writes very explicitly about sex.
Yeah.
And, like, about the penis, and talk about poetic language. Like, this tower surrounded by two turrets feeding it with...
That's actually the point, though, is it's poetic. Right. That's a big point, though, because he talks about it. Yeah, he talks about another sort of pornography in the 18th century that was, what was it? I don't remember the name. It was like the memoir of some lily or something like that. But it was in like 1750, and it was a very sort of poetical, euphemistic, metaphorical sex thing. What's the sex thing? Romantic novel, I guess I should say. Right. But then, fast forward about 100 years later, you have that memoir that he discusses, which is called My Secret Life, which we talked about previously, which is much more just raunchy. It's like very explicit, very detailed, no poeticism. It's not
particularly artistic.
Exactly. And the other example he uses is Marquis de Sade, who... Of course, I think is where the etymology is. I think, actually, we should look this up. It was where sadism, I think his name is.
That's neat.
Maybe. Hang on, let me just ask.
Right.
Is Marquis de Sade's name where sadism
ask who? Who are you asking?
Google.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, nice.
Yes.
Well, because the Old Testament
Yes.
has the Song of Psalms, the Song of Songs, with a lot of poetic sexual imagery, kind of more in line with the Hildegard thing. But then, at the same time, there's the New Testament and parts of the Old Testament that have laws concerning sexual behavior. Because there's the whole time where they're going to stone the woman taken in adultery, and Jesus, the whole cast the first stone, let he without sin, blah, 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 that whole thing. But that suggests that there are morality laws that the state
as
is
I
enforcing.
said, right. Yes. But I think his point would be that it was more... I agree. I don't know what his point would be. I think maybe his point would just be that was the Middle East and not Europe.
That's the Middle East. That's not Europe. I'm not talking
it's
about
true.
that.
It's like
Right.
God only knows what the Goths and the Gauls. I mean,
Right.
this would be Gaul, right? They were up to all sorts of things back then.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's the thing is, I don't know. And you're right. He's not talking about Japan or China. He's talking about Europe for sure.
Yes, no, and no, but he does talk about Japan and China in the Sciencia Sexualis. I think that Sciencia Sexualis, yeah, which is the third chapter or whatever. And it's discussing basically how there were two ways to sort of, I guess. Here, let me just try to find the quote so I can use the exact. Because actually, I read this a little while ago, so it's not as fresh. Historically, there have been two great procedures for producing the truth of sex. So this is page 57 in my edition. So on the one hand, the societies, and they are numerous: China, Japan, India, Rome, the Arabo-Muslim societies, which endowed themselves with an ars erotica. So in the erotic art, so it's the erotic art, truth is drawn from pleasure itself, understood as a practice and accumulated as experience. Pleasure is not considered in relation to an absolute law of the permitted and the forbidden, nor by reference to a criterion of utility, but first and foremost in relation to itself. It is experienced as pleasure, evaluated in terms of its intensity, its specific quality, its duration, its reverberations in the body and the soul. Moreover, this knowledge must be deflected back into the sexual practice itself in order to shape it as though from within and amplify its effects. I don't know. He's getting very poetical. So
they have a nice system for talking about how good sex is.
Yes.
Cool.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just.
I guess we'll have to read it, but my question is to Foucault is, so what?
Well, so in return, on the face of it at least, our civilization possesses no ars erotica. In return, it is undoubtedly the only civilization to practice a Sciencia Sexualis.
Right.
Or rather, the only civilization to have developed over the centuries procedures for telling the truth of sex which are geared to a form of knowledge power strictly opposed to the art of initiations and the masterful secret. I have in mind the confession.
Right.
So... Right. Since the Middle Ages, at least, right? And then so he goes into all that. And yeah, he talks about how actually in the Middle Ages, there were certain people that wrote about, the way you're supposed to confess your sexual sins. And you're supposed to be very detailed, apparently, which,
Right.
Anyway, who knows what was going on back then. What if sex in our society on a scale of several centuries was something that was placed within an unrelenting system of confession? The transformation of sex into discourse.
Right. But I don't... Okay, so maybe there's some distinction between like scientific discourse and artistic expression. And I think there is some difference. But it seems to me that even, in the Middle East, having an art of expressing, levels of how good sex is feels like it's a classification system of sorts. Is it not its own form of discourse and power being exerted on the experience?
I agree. This is where I also kind of wonder what the distinction here is, and I guess it might just be that it is less defined.
Sure.
I think that's really the big thing.
Right.
It is defined, but it's not defined as much, maybe.
Yeah. How many reverberation? How deep did you feel it versus what's the quantity of sperm you ejaculated?
Right. But even the Jesus story, he who has cast the first stone, meaning that hey man, we've all done it. Isn't that what he's saying essentially?
Yeah.
He's saying have forgiveness if you commit adultery because it's
right.
You
but then
probably
he also
sinned
tells
at
her
some
to
point.
go forth and sin no more.
Right. But
he does.
She already
he's
did.
like, I got your back, but stop it.
But this is the point: would there be as much forgiveness for that in his society? And actually, adultery was a big deal. I mean, adultery is what sank
Right.
Hamilton.
Yeah,
basically.
she was going to be stoned because she was taken in adultery.
Right. And my point is in the yes, right. They were going to stone her, and I'm sure many people were stoned back then for that, right? But the point is that Jesus was saying not to, I suppose, which served as maybe a big philosophical shift, right? I think the idea of forgiveness.
Right. Yeah, it's huge. I think I remember Nietzsche writing something about that as kind of a way of exerting power in a sneaky way.
Forgiveness?
The whole Jesus story. I mean, he was not very into it, or he was very.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember what he was saying. He was saying it was like the story of Jesus was the ultimate Jewish sneakery.
I don't remember that. Was that in the Genealogy of Morals?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I would say that he would say that there is a power dynamic there because for what we said is there's always every being has a will to power.
Right, but by placing power in a form of forgiveness, it's both very attractive and it eliminates the entrenched power of the, what was he calling, the Roman nobles, the warriors. Because it was this whole thing about the Jews against the warrior class, or the knightly class.
Yeah. Well, yes, right. I mean, we could go into a whole thing on that, but yeah, it's the idea that really that the meek, right? The whole meek shall inherit the earth. I think that sort of summarizes the philosophy of the Christians.
Right.
And then, yes, the Roman philosophy was actually the strong, right?
Right.
Shall inherit the earth, basically.
No, the meek, no, the strong.
I mean, that's really what in my summary, that's how I see what Nietzsche was saying in that.
Right, but I would say from a Foucault perspective, back to the power thing, obviously we don't have Foucault here. What I imagine is the idea is that it is competing groups or structures trying to wield power over one another. So the meek are trying to figure out a way to wield power, and the knights are trying to figure out a way to keep their power. Mm-hmm. But it isn't just knights oppressing the meek. It is a battle. Right.
Yes. Yeah. So you're saying that's how Foucault would describe it?
That's my understanding of Foucault and his relation to power. And power is in a constant, forces of power are in constant struggle with one another. And the whole thing that we are in a power struggle right now, each kind of battling back.
Oh, we definitely are.
Are we?
You and I, yeah.
No, that's only when we're talking about anarchism.
It's funny. I was actually just thinking, I really am an anarchist. It's just, I think I just, I can't like I would like to be an anarchist, maybe I should say, but
right,
because I think it's like, I mean, you know me. I mean, I'm more solo than you are. In fact, like you have more of a community than I do.
right.
You know what I mean? But it's just the big fish eat the little fish. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
And the big fish are the organized fish.
Is that true? Like tuna are super organized.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at them from a cellular perspective, more cells organized.
Nice.
In a more intricate fashion.
Wait, really? Than like a minnow?
Well, I would say...
What?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, what the hell are we talking about?
I don't know.
So, I feel like we haven't... I mean, I summarized it, but, we haven't really gone sequentially through it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we need to. But, I mean, so it starts off, we the other Victorians. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just maybe saying, because the Victorian age is so prudish.
Right.
And he's basically proposing... not to be.
Right. So there's a section in the first chapter where he lays out 3 questions to ask regarding the repressive hypothesis. And so it's nice because it's a little list. And he lays it out a lot better than, who was it who would say I have 3 things and then list 2 and then never really get to the third one? Was that Nietzsche?
I think that was Nietzsche. Oh.
That would drive me crazy.
It was also Socrates, kind of.
Yeah, he'd be like, there's 3 main things. The first is this, and then the second he'd like kind of say, and then trail off and never get to the
third. Or get to the third, like 2 books later. Yeah.
Anyway, so he puts repressive hypothesis in quotes. So what would you say the repressive hypothesis is? Because it seems like
I defined that, didn't I?
You probably did.
Yeah. The repressive, but it's good. We could do it again. Repressive hypothesis is this hypothesis that beginning in the 17th century or thereabouts, maybe 18th century, I think it was a general, maybe historical hypothesis that society became more prudish with sex.
Right. And so he says that there's 3 serious doubts that he has concerning this hypothesis. The first is sexual repression truly an established historical fact? So that's a great question. I love asking that question, but
yeah, and he argues no. I would say, and he does a lot of that in the second book,
right,
or the second volume.
The second doubt: do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? So then he to explain a little bit more, are prohibition, censorship, and denial truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way? I don't know.
Which he would say yes, I think.
Right. And then the third doubt, well, it seems like he's suggesting no, though.
That sex is used for power, or maybe I
no. So these are doubts that he has of the repressive hypothesis.
I'm sorry.
And so he's saying, are these mechanisms truly the mechanisms of power?
Are what?
Things like prohibition, censorship, and denial. Is that how power is actually exercised? It seems like he's saying no.
That's interesting because I thought he was saying yes on that.
I feel
like he's
when I'm reading him, as I'm reading him, I think he's saying something, and then it's like, I guess it's the same as Nietzsche.
Because just because it's a doubt doesn't mean that he can't go and then find out it's true. Because I just feel, but maybe I'm misunderstanding here. I'll do some more research because we'll have a 2-week break before we do this. So
I think he's saying these things are exercised, but they're not sort of the true locus of the way power is exercised.
I was thinking that as well, actually. So I just might be misunderstanding what the true locus is.
And then the third and final doubt. It's nice that he only has 3 doubts. Did the critical discourse that addresses itself to repression come to act as a roadblock to a power mechanism that had operated unchallenged up to that point? Or is it, in fact, part of the same historical network as the thing it denounces by calling it repression. So I run into a problem right away because I don't have a good sense for what he means by critical discourse.
Well, I I think it's kind of what we're talking. It was like having a analytical discourse in some ways, like studying it.
Really?
Basically.
The way I understand
which is kind
it,
of
he means
ironic,
critical
honestly.
discourse in the Marcuse sense of an oppressor-oppressed dynamic.
He probably does. I mean, but I don't know.
This is this weird thing. Critical is, it's a word that's ruined in my mind now.
That's, I guess, my question is, in this context, I don't know. This is where we're just idiots.
Yeah, that's great.
And because I was going to say, actually, is like, maybe going back to the locus of power, maybe it is this power over life thing that he's getting at the end in the fifth part. Maybe I just didn't make that connection, but maybe that's what he's saying.
Right.
Is that the locus of power is this desire for them to live longer.
Right.
But I don't know. Anyway.
But I think this third doubt is talking about the discussion of repression itself. Is that not also baked into the same power structure of repression? By calling the system a repressive system, you're engaging in the power structure that is doing that thing.
Right.
It's like when he's talking about the subversive attitude, the idea that because something is repressed, we need to be subversive and like anti-authoritarian and talk about it and be as open about it as we can. And that is essentially bolstering the claim that this thing is repressed and taboo. So all of these things, every action, whether or not you're for the repression or against it, is going towards, is accepting it as a narrative or something like that.
Yeah, I think that actually jives with, because I think he criticizes a guy in the fourth chapter, the deployment of sexuality, William Reich, because I think his whole criticism of him is that he's the fact that it always unfolded within the deployment of sexuality and not outside it or against it. So he had a critique of sexual repression,
right?
But it would never be a successful critique because it was always within, I guess, the vernacular of sexuality.
Right.
And if you actually want to, is that what you're saying, I guess? Is that in order to actually criticize something, you need to like get out of the system.
Right. You cannot criticize the system by rebelling against the system. Either.
Right.
Because rebelling against the system is reaffirming the system. So he has these doubts about the repression hypothesis. And then he says the central issue is not to determine whether one says yes or no to sex, whether one formulates prohibitions or permissions, whether one asserts its importance or denies its effects, or whether one refines the words one uses to designate it, but to account for the fact that it is spoken about, to discover who does the speaking, the positions and viewpoints from which they speak, the institutions which prompt people to speak about it, and which store and distribute things that are said. What is at issue, briefly, is the overall discursive fact, the way in which sex is put into discourse. So I think it's like, who's doing the speaking, what are they speaking about, and why?
Right.
Not that people are saying it's a taboo or not, but who are they and why are they saying it's a taboo?
But that's why, getting back to that second doubt.
Right.
Can you read the second doubt again?
Do the workings of power, and in particular those mechanisms that are brought into play in societies such as ours, really belong primarily to the category of repression? Are prohibition, censorship, and denial truly the forms through which power is exercised in a general way? If not in every society, most certainly in our own.
So that first part, maybe that's true. Maybe they don't belong to the category of repression.
Mm-hmm.
The second part is still the part that I feel like he is saying that power is working through those.
And then he designates it as a historico-theoretical question.
Yes. And that's the William Reich.
Mm-hmm. I mean, but it's another good one here. I do not maintain that the prohibition of sex is a ruse, which is interesting right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
He's not saying that the prohibition of sex is some deep conspiracy. But it is a ruse to make prohibition into the basic constitutive element from which one would be able to write the history of what has been said concerning sex, starting from the modern epoch. And so this is actually a problem that I have with the way a lot of history is written, not with respect to sex, but kind of the whole critical theory thing. The idea that we look at everything before 1980 or 1990 or something. It's just like, if we go back, all we see is, but there was slavery, but women were oppressed, but something. And it's like, that's not all that was happening. And the idea is, what is the ruse? I think that is the ruse, to make it so that there is only one particular way to discuss a topic in history. So if you discuss women in the 1800s, you just have to talk about oppression.
Mm-hmm. You're saying he's saying that's the ruse.
That's the ruse. And that's where I agree with him.
Yeah.
The ruse isn't that women were oppressed. That is like a complex structure of society that has happened that we have fought against. But that doesn't mean that is the only way to look at the history of society. Right. Nor even the best way. It is it's a narrative of a way to frame things for a certain reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And often the framing is for power.
Right.
Or I think always, I guess, the framing is for power.
Right. Yeah, probably always. At least from, I think from Foucault or Nietzsche's perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Which is where they have the, yeah. Yeah, so I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, so this is where I guess we can start talking. Is there any other stuff you wanted to discuss specifically? I mean, there is a lot.
There's a ton of good things. Too. I have like a bunch of stuff highlighted, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I think that last bit, to me, is the most important bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and that's, I guess, really that's, I think, the thing that you like about postmodernism most.
Yes.
Right? Is the idea that everything's a narrative.
And it forces you to face that you're engaging in narrative whether you want to be or not.
Right. And you might be engaging in narrative or are engaging in narrative for a power reason. I guess so. It's like maybe this is, where do we go with this? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't know.
To me, I don't know where you go with it, because I think you can sit in an academic department and dismantle the universe with words all day long. But I think that, to me, there's a more practical side of things. It's about being careful to check yourself when you are trying to exercise power on other people.
It's
when you're trying to say, you shouldn't do this with your life. This should be illegal. Right. You shouldn't be allowed to do this with your life. Right. That kind of thing. It's like, that's when you really need to think.
Who are you to say that? Yeah. I mean, it's self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you're saying.
Right.
Yeah. And I agree. I think that is where it leads. Was that what he was saying, I wonder, though?
Well, so in the next chapter, he talks about the innovations of power in the 18th century. And it starts to feel like I'm seeing there the creation of modernity and what we call today the nanny state, things like that. But it's both social and state systems of power that are there to help you, there for your own good. Why do we have sex education in schools? Right. If you start talking about getting rid of sex education in schools, people get upset. Where are kids going to learn to be safe? Where are kids going to learn this and that? Mm-hmm. And it's all of these things. It's under the guise of helping you, and it's under the guise of helping kids and for your own good and blah, 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 all these things.
Well, but this is the thing. You're reading minds now, too. It's like, I think this, and we had this debate, I think, actually, in maybe the last episode of the path to hell paved with good intentions, right? It's like, it's hard to say, though, what I think a lot of people are operating on the assumption that what they're doing is benevolent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not saying they're doing it to be evil. I'm saying they're exercising power.
Exactly, yes.
I don't think people who want sex education in schools are usually trying to hurt people. I think that there are certain types of people, specifically in the education sphere, that very, very strongly try and control the situation, presumably because they think that that's best.
Right, and this is the thing, though, is that I think it's then how do you deal with the people who think that they're doing good, but in reality they're doing bad?
Right.
Which we would call insanity.
Yeah, I mean, but for me, this is like everybody. I don't think, like personally, I don't think that if there's going to be public education, there should even be history or sex. Any of these things are way too complicated, and they should teach like math and reading, and that's about it. And you should be in school for like 3 hours a day, maybe.
And then be on the farm.
Or whatever. Just like, they're like, from my perspective, kids do not belong to the school.
Well, in some ways, I think school was also invented in its current form as a kind of daycare.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's like you need the parents to be efficient members of the society. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, which I think it all is, again, going to this general trend that you had the states were becoming formed. They were starting to be formed in the 17th century.
Right.
These giant organized entities that were, they were capitalist driven. They were these engines, and so this made all of these things happen, all these bad things, all these good things, like the technological innovations that have made our lives easier in so many ways. But also you have all of these other things. But it is interesting. I mean, this is why, the communists exist, right? Is because they saw this back in the 19th century, and this was the reaction against although it is ironic then that communism actually sort of creates, I would say, even larger states. Like it requires a big state to actually work, right? A centralized state.
Right, because it requires totalitarianism. It requires everything.
But in philosophy, it was working against the capitalist engine that was sort of exploiting the workers and everything like that.
Right.
That was why it was made.
Right.
But in reality, it was still became succumbed to this thing, which then goes back to what I've been saying about how it does feel like maybe it's just a biological law, and we are just biologics, right?
Wait, what's the biological law?
The law of aggregation.
Of aggregation. Wait,
everything aggregates if you give it enough time, and then probably de-aggregates.
What do you mean?
After
aggregates?
A certain amount of time. Like just, you have even just, you can choose any level. Let's take the cellular level. The progression is unicellular to multicellular. Let's take the molecular level. The progression is atomic to molecule, right? So let's take the macro level.
You mean that atoms form molecules?
They organize into bigger complexes.
I see.
And so what is the modern state but a large aggregation and organized aggregation of biologics?
Right.
So maybe it's inevitable.
Yeah, I mean,
cellularization.
This is what the bass player in my group, Sapaclaw Elixir, used to say. He used to say, it's inevitable, we have to just go to one world government. We should stop fighting it.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen.
It feels that way sometimes, just because if we become more connected and everything
so
like
we just
that.
become the Borg,
Yeah, but it's, but the big thing that we have, though, the reason that we're even thinking about it is because we have this thing, consciousness, and it's not clear that these cells have that or the atoms have that.
So this is where I am slightly like religious or spiritual or mystical or something. To me, this is where something like Rose Wilder Lane speaks to me. Like, the calling is not that. The calling is to be free. And all of those things are essentially like the forces of Satan.
Or maybe your calling is the force of Satan.
Perhaps.
Maybe de-aggregation's the force of Satan.
I'll be the Antichrist. That's cool.
Yes. There's the episode title. I'll be the Antichrist. That's cool.
But it resonates in the story of Exodus. It's also like the history of Reconstruction in the U.S. after slavery.
In the Tower of Babel, right?
But it's the, you know, when you talk about it, it's made life easier for everybody. The idea of centralized power has an efficiency to it. And this
Did you hear what I said, though? The Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
That's preaching de-aggregation. That's saying, like, don't. You're supposed to be distinct.
Right. Yeah, don't get too...
And we talked about how the Bible is basically just consciousness manifested.
Did we? That's wild. I don't remember that particular. Yeah. I believe you. I just don't remember.
I didn't summarize it like that, but that's when I keep saying how it's like,
Bible,
you know,
it's just manifest. What the hell? I need to write that. I need to think about that statement.
The hell does that mean, man? Maybe that should be the episode title.
Or is it just the Bible?
Well, any religious text.
Okay. Huh. Okay, neat.
Did you Google that?
No, I just wrote it down. I want to think about it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we've talked about that though, and it's not like my idea. I'm pretty sure. I assume this is what like Jung is getting at when he talks about archetypes and everything, but it's just this idea that like, what's the voice in somebody's head telling you the commandments, other than you could say it's God or you could say it's consciousness.
Right.
It's just it's like maybe you were on mushrooms, maybe you're schizophrenic, but somebody had this in their head and then they wrote it down. And then you just look at all the like the Garden of Eden. It's just there's all these symbolisms. You don't think about being naked if you're unconscious, if you're an animal, right? But then you are all of a sudden you're aware of your nakedness. What is that? That's consciousness. And when you look at all the commandments, I interpret them as just things that the whole golden rule thing is just, that's, again, you can't do empathy without consciousness because it requires an ability to put somebody else's mind into yours, or vice versa, whatever. And all the commandments have to do with empathy. Like, don't kill somebody because you don't want to be killed. Don't have sex with your neighbor.
What about don't take the Lord's name in vain?
Yeah, because if you were the Lord, would you want somebody to take your name in vain?
I've seen so many Jordan Peterson clips about that particular commandment recently.
Interesting.
It's pretty, because he said it's not about swearing. It's an injunction to not use the word of God falsely. Don't preach that you are a spokesperson for God as a lie. Don't say things that God didn't say. Like, it's like extremely evil to speak for God falsely.
Right. Which is like, would you want somebody to speak falsely on your behalf?
Right. No, I would not.
There you go.
I don't care if they take my name in vain.
Right. Yeah.
They can say Antushka, damn it.
Sure. No, I mean, I agree. Like, obviously, you maybe have to reach a little bit.
Right.
What
about keep the Sabbath holy?
Yeah, I mean, there's arbitrary stuff. I don't know. I mean, But I'm like, what are the big ones, though? Don't kill, don't steal.
The first one is the Sabbath.
Yeah. Well, in my head, what are the big ones? How about that? What are the big ones that transferred into our society?
Right.
In my head,
are the ones we like.
Well, no, I think the things that last in time, that's the distillation process, the showing what are the important things.
Right.
If it lasts, generally, obviously, a lot of things are lost, though. But if it's going to make it to this time, enough people had to copy it down and write it so that it could get transferred.
Right. Yeah,
for it to
because
be
we
real.
got, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, is number one.
Mm-hmm.
Then make no graven image of me. Not taking the Lord's name in vain.
I mean, you could
Keep
look
the
at
Sabbath.
weird consciousness things with that of just like, you know.
I mean, actually,
Don't
I
be
heard a
schizophrenic.
rabbi say the thing about the I am the Lord your God. It's important that that's the first commandment, because that's an injunction against the what's arrogance of humanity. I'm God, you're not.
Yeah.
I make the rules of the universe, you don't. That's what the first commandment means. It's a commandment to be humble in the face.
Or it's
of
an
God.
introduction.
What?
Or it's an introduction.
Right? Yeah, like, hello, I'm God.
I'm the Lord your God.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, maybe.
You know, because you got to introduce your consciousness to
Right.
yourself.
And then the fifth is honor your mother and father.
Mm-hmm.
Then don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't bear false witness against your neighbor, and then don't covet your neighbor's house, wife, male servant, female servant, ox, donkey, or anything else. That one's funny because it starts a list and then it gets tired, goes, or anything else.
Well, I was going to say, is it like, and this is my theological ignorance, I'm sorry, I didn't pay attention in Sunday school. But do people interpret it as like this is the most important one and then decreasing importance?
Often.
1 to 10?
I mean, I think that there's an argument that they're all from God, so.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter. And I mean, yes, there are examples here that I could say are maybe the whim of man, as I guess heretical as that is to say, because my general point I think is beyond that of just what is just an idea of a God talking to you. Where are these voices coming from? You can say it's outside of yourself,
right?
But that's an opinion in some sense.
Right.
That's hard to prove.
Well, because in the Bible, this
prove
wasn't given right away. This is also on Moses' request, because they keep messing up, and then God keeps killing them, and he's like, can you please just give them some ground rules?
Yes, right. And yes, but yeah, the more sort of general point, and then we talked about this too with the Eastern religions, then is you lean away from consciousness,
right?
And the Western religions are you lean into it through the confessional, et cetera.
Right.
And then you read the Tao, and it's all about don't go outside. Like as soon as you go anywhere, you're like nowhere or whatever.
Right.
And in my head, I'm reading that as as soon as you start extrapolating into other areas, you've already lost the game. So in order to stay centered, you need to stay in the moment.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is all about focusing on, and then you can get into the meditation stuff of Buddhism, focusing on your breath.
Mm-hmm.
That's all just about getting out of the conscious brain and just getting into the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And focusing on your breathing is one way to do that.
Right.
Because it's immediate.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just giving you more examples of how religion is consciousness manifest. I thought we talked about this.
We might have. I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm not forgetting
it's okay.
on purpose.
No. It's okay. I don't know why I don't mean to say that with a tone as if like God, dude. I just, I was actually just checking I wanted to check. None of this sounds familiar.
Some of it sounds somewhat familiar. It's not like I don't think we've touched on versions of these concepts. It's just in these terms. I don't remember it.
What do you think of that?
The consciousness manifest.
You said you were going to think about it, so we don't.
I need to think. I need to think more about it because I'm also now you're talking about Eastern religions, and now I'm thinking like anti-consciousness, and then it's like, is that the satanic?
Yeah, I think that's it.
Because we have talked about that, and then I think is Foucault a force of Satan?
Yes,
right.
Of course.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean the guy's a sadomasochist.
Right. Well, at least he's got both.
Haven't you seen South Park?
I've seen South Park.
Remember Satan and Saddam?
Yep.
All the shenanigans they were getting down to.
I like that Satan's the prude.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
Saddam
was so inappropriate.
Yeah.
That's like the funniest thing of all time.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're way off now.
That's fine.
We're not even talking about Foucault
I think
anymore.
we did it.
Yeah, we did. So here's the question. Do you want to read on this, or do you want to go to the second volume?
What would be the difference?
So I think, honestly, we kind of covered all the big points of this first one.
Okay.
Although I guess I'm going to, double check. I think we clarified the second doubt part, but also he's addressing this in all the volumes.
Uh-huh.
So the second volume, I think, is more historical, like talking about the Greeks.
Cool.
And
I feel like that's going to get risky, but fine.
yes, it is. I mean, even the part that I was reading is risky.
I mean, the one thing he mentioned in here was teaching kids how to get a good prostitute.
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
So I don't know. What do you think?
That sounds hilarious.
Okay, well, so we do second volume. Let me think about which parts, but I guess if you want to just order it and
Okay. Yeah, sounds good.
yeah, or whatever you do,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that actually makes sense. We could do a little bit of the second volume, try to summarize it, and then do a little bit of the third volume
Sure.
and try to summarize it.
Sounds good. And what do you have planned for next week?
Well, I think we're going to just go back to the music. So
That book?
Antushka's going on a European tour. So Brother X is going to be filling in for 2 weeks.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we're going to do the music stuff. So we'll have a halt on the Foucault stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
But we'll be back.
Yeah, don't worry, everybody.
Yeah.
Don't
our
worry.
legions of fans and listeners and non-fans.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I kind of hope... I love the idea of someone listening to us, like, so angry. Like, they're so stupid.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, we are. It's true. We are.
Yeah. And then we have a show in a month.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
May 3rd.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. And I just learned about somebody asked me if I could go to their show on the 4th, but I don't think I will. I forgot. Oh, yeah. What do you think Oh, you said you have a gig on the 4th, right?
Yeah. I got like an all day thing.
Right.
Actually, on the 3rd, it starts on the 3rd, and they want us to come by after our show.
Oh,
yeah.
That's cool.
Make a guest
just
appearance.
to say, oh,
yeah.
My God.
Because ours is over at 8. It's not so late this time. So.
Oh, yeah. What time does it start?
Our show, it's 5 to 8.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, because it's like a brewery,
Yep, Cella's
right?
Brewery. It's a fun spot.
Okay. God, I got to think.
It'll be great. What? God.
Sorry. Oh, wait, we're promoting.
You only have to play an hour by yourself. And then...
No. I'm not worried about that. I got to think of making a more brewery. Hey, I'm going to take this out. Don't worry.
What? Your set was
shouldn't.
fine. We could do the exact same set.
Really? Okay. I just always wonder about the existentialism of my songs. But I guess people can't make out the lyrics probably, right?
Here's the thing about a brewery. Most people aren't listening.
That's
the
true.
thing is,
Yes.
when we play at Dog and Bone, it's
People
such
are
a small
listening.
room that we just have like these couples that came for a beer captive.
Yeah, I know. It's funny.
Like, what could they do but listen?
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
Here at this place, we'll be up on a big stage.
Mm-hmm. Got lights.
Yeah, some lights.
Nice. But we're using your PA, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have one. So. Yep.
All right.
Cool. All right.
Yeah, I think that's it, right?
I think so.
All right.
Bye.
See ya.